Before Haiti was poor, Haiti was the richest colony in the entire Western world, more valuable to France than all of its other colonies combined. One third of all Europeans' sugar, more than half of its coffee, all of it produced on the backs of enslaved African people, who were worked, beaten, branded, and killed so that France could be great. They called this island Saint Dominique. They called it the Pearl of the Antilles. But the people who built that pearl were not allowed to keep it until they decided one night in 1791 to take it back. What happened next was one of the greatest acts of human courage in recorded history, and the world has been making Haiti pay for it ever since. Part 1. The Pearl. What Haiti was before they broke it. Let me paint you a picture of what Saint Dominique was before 1791. 500,000 enslaved Africans, 40,000 white colonists, 30,000 free people of color, mixed race, some wealthy, some with their own land. The enslaved outnumbered the whites by more than 10 to 1. France extracted enormous wealth from this island. Plantation owners grew fantastically rich. The French economy was built on what Haitian bodies produced. And the conditions were among the most brutal in the entire Atlantic slave system. Enslaved people on Saint Dominique were worked so hard, so fast, that they died faster than they could be replaced. French kept importing new captives from Africa because the old ones kept dying from exhaustion. This is what the Pearl of Antilles actually was. Not a jewel, a machine powered by suffering. Part 2. The night it changed. The revolution begins August 21, 1791. In the hills of the north, enslaved people gathered at a place called Yos Caiman, a voodoo ceremony, a spiritual covenant, a vow that they would live free or die fighting. The revolts erupt that same night. Within weeks, thousands of enslaved people had risen. Plantations burned across the north of the island. Within months, they controlled a third of Saint Dominique. The man who emerged as the military genius of this revolution was Toussaint Louverture, a formerly enslaved man who had taught himself to read, a man who had studied Caesar's military campaigns, a man who built an army out of people the world said were not even humans. He defeated French forces. He defeated Spanish forces that tried to take advantage of the chaos. He defeated British forces, 60,000 of them, who arrived in 1793 to conquer the island and lost 40,000 men doing it. By 1801, Toussaint had declared himself Governor General for life and written a constitution that abolished slavery across the entire island. Part 3. Napoleon's revenge and how it was defeated. Napoleon Bonaparte looked at Toussaint Louverture and saw a problem. Not a man, a problem. A formerly enslaved black man running a country, writing constitutions, commanding armies, defeating Europeans. This could not stand. Not because of politics, because of what it meant. In 1802, Napoleon sent his brother-in-law, General Leclerc, to Saint Dominique with 40,000 French soldiers, the finest army in the whole world at that time, with order to crush the revolution and restore slavery. Captured Toussaint through treachery. They invited him to negotiate, and when he came, they arrested him. They put him on a ship to France, locked him in a cold stone fortress in the mountains, Fort de Jos, interrogated him, starved him, froze him. Toussaint Louverture died in that prison on April 7, 1903. He never saw Haiti free. But here is what French could not kill. The idea had already spread. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, one of Toussaint's generals, took command and continued the fight. Henry Christopher fought alongside him. On November 18, 1903, at the Battle of Vertières, Haitian forces delivered Napoleon's army into most humiliating defeat. Of the original 40,000 French soldiers, fewer than 7,000 survived to return home. Yellow fever had done much of the killing, but Haitian warriors did the rest. On January 1st, 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines stood before his people and declared the independence of Haiti. The first and only nation in human history born from a successful slave revolution. They tore the white from the French tricolor flag and sewed the blue and red back together with nothing in the middle. No white, no colonizer, no master. The name they chose, Haiti, was the original Taino name for the island. Before Columbus, before France, before slavery. They reach back past all of it. Part 4, the punishment, begins immediately. The world was watching, and the world did not celebrate. The world was terrified. Enslaved people had won. Black people had won. They had beaten Napoleon. They had beaten Britain. They had beaten Spain. Every slaveholding nation on earth understood what this meant. If Haiti could do this, their enslaved people might try. The United States, led by President Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner himself, imposed a trade embargo on Haiti. Jefferson called the Haitian Revolution the preposterous idea of Negro government and worked actively to isolate the new nation because he feared he would inspire enslaved Africans in America to revolt. The embargo crippled Haitian trade. The isolation cut off the young nation from the market it needed to rebuild. And the United States would not officially recognize Haiti independence for 58 years, until 1862, under Abraham Lincoln. Long after Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson, and every other slave-holding president had died. France did not recognize Haiti either, and France had 14 warships and 528 cannons, ready to explain why. Part 5, the ransom, the greatest hit in history. April 17, 1825, 21 years after Haiti declared independence, a French warship sailed into the harbor of Port-au-Prince. Not one ship, 14, armed with 528 cannons. On board was Baron de Macaulay, emissary of King Charles X of France. He carried a royal ordinance, an ultimatum. France would recognize Haiti independence. In exchange, Haiti would pay France 150 million gold francs. This was the compensation France demanded for the loss of its slave plantations. Compensation for the loss of the people they had enslaved. You read that correctly. Compensation for the loss of the people they had enslaved. The formerly enslaved people of Haiti were being ordered to pay their former slave masters for the crime of liberating themselves. The amount demanded was staggering, 10 times what the United States had paid France for the entire Louisiana purchase, which had doubled the size of America. The debt was calculated at nearly 280% of Haiti's entire GDP. Haiti had no choice. With 14 warships and 528 cannons in the harbor, with the memory of Napoleon's attempt to re-enslave them still fresh, Haitian President John Pierre Boyer signed, under the threat of military invasion, at literal gunpoint. The double debt, the trap within the trap. Haiti could not pay 150 million francs outright. Nobody could. So France directed Haiti to borrow the first 30 million francs from a French bank to pay France. This was the double debt. Haiti was forced to go into debt to pay the debt that France had forced on them for freeing themselves. By 1838, France agreed to reduce the total to 90 million francs, payable over 30 years. But the loan to pay those payments required more loans. And those loans had interest. And by 1914, more than 3/4 of Haiti's entire national budget was still being drained every year to repay French banks. In 1914, before the United States even invaded, American Marines arrived in the Port-au-Prince and physically removed 500,000 in gold from Haiti National Bank vaults. They just go there, go and steal the gold. Jesus Christ, I can't believe. They put it on a ship to New York, the National City Bank, the institution now known as Citibank. Then in 1915, the United States invaded fully, 19 years of military occupation. They rewrote Haiti's constitution to allow foreign ownership of land, something Haiti had explicitly banned since 1804 to protect its sovereignty. They took control of the custom houses, the treasury, the tax system. They created a new military structure that would later be used by the Duvalier dictatorship to control the population. The final payment on Haiti independence debt was made in 1947. 143 years after they declared independence. A 2022 New York Times investigation calculated that the total transferred from Haiti to France and its banks was the equivalent of approximately $560 million in today's money. And had that money stayed in Haiti and been invested domestically, it could have added more than $20 billion to Haiti economy over time. At 7, France demands what it will not pay. Now let us sit with this contradiction. France will not pay reparation to countries it enslaved. France will not pay reparation to Africa. France will not acknowledge the full truth of what the CFA franc system has extracted from 14 African countries for the past 80 years. But France sent warship to demand their formerly enslaved Haitians pay reparation to their slave masters and collected for 122 years. The word reparation means to repair the damage done. France decided that the damage that mattered was the damage done to the people who owned other human beings, not the people who were owned, not the people who were beaten and branded and worked to death, not the people who had to fight and die to be free, the slave masters. And when the Haitian president finally stood up and said enough, France and America made sure he never got the chance to make the case in court. January 1st, 2004, Haiti was celebrating its 200th anniversary of independence. President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, Haitian's first democratically elected president, stood before his people and made an announcement. He had calculated exactly what France owned Haiti, down to the cent. 21,685,135,571.48 dollars. He demanded France pay it back. France was furious. French diplomat privately described the demand as a dangerous precedent, because if France paid Haiti, every former colony in Africa and the Caribbean would have the right to ask the same question. Within months, Aristide was gone. In February 2004, armed rebels moved toward Port-au-Prince. A U.S. plane arrived. Aristide says he was told to get on it. He called it a kidnapping. He was flown directly to the Central African Republic. France-owned ambassador to Haiti at the time, Thierry Bocard, later admitted to the New York Times in 2022 that France and the United States had effectively orchestrated a coup against Aristide. And he admitted that his removal was, quote, probably a bit about his demand for reparation. A bit about. The man who asked France to pay back what he stole was removed from office and exiled from his own country. The legal team had already drafted the case. The 2004 coup halted the legal proceeding before they could be filed. Why Haiti is poor? The real answer. People ask, why is Haiti so poor? And the answer they give on television is corruption, bad governance, natural disasters, poor leadership. All of those things are real. The Duvalier dictatorship, father and son, looted the country for 30 years. The loans taken during that period alone accounted for roughly 40% of Haiti debt in the year 2000. But none of those things happened in a vacuum. Duvaliers were allowed to stay in power because they were useful to the United States as a Cold War buffer against Cuba. The military structure, the U.S. Marine Belt, during the 1915 occupation was the exact structure the Duvaliers used to control the country. Haiti did not become poor because of bad governance. Haiti was made poor deliberately, systematically, as punishment for the audacity to be free. The debt that ran from 1825 to 1947 was not a natural disaster. It was a policy. The U.S. occupation from 1915 to 1934 was not an accident. It was a calculation. The 2004 coup that removed the president who asked for justice was not a coincidence. It was a response. Today, gangs control an estimated 85% of Port-au-Prince. Haiti is listed as one of the poorest countries on earth, and France has still not paid back a single franc. Part 10, the insult that will not end. In 2016, the French parliament symbolically replaced the 1825 ordinance, a symbolic gesture. No money, no apology, no acknowledgement of the full scope of the damage. A symbol. In 2025, 200 years after the warship arrived, President Macron announced a joint commission of French and Haitian historians to study the impact of the 1825 debt. A commission to study whether the damage happened. We already knew it happened. The receipts exist. The loan documents exist. The payment records exist. The New York Times published them all. Scholar Marlene Dott of Yale University called it the greatest hit in history. She was not exaggerating. The French economist Thomas Piketty, not a radical, not an activist, a mainstream European economist, calculated in 2020 that France owes Haiti at least $28 billion. France has refused, while simultaneously refusing to acknowledge that the CFA franc system still extracts wealth from 14 African nations and parks it in the French treasury. France does not pay. France collects. That is the system. That has always been the system. Haiti did something that had never been done before in human history. Enslave people. People the world said were property, organized themselves, built an army, defeated Napoleon, defeated Britain, defeated Spain, wrote a constitution, declared a free republic, and named their country after the original people who lived there, before any European had even set foot on the island. That is not poverty. That is not failure. That is one of the greatest achievements in the history of humanity. What happened after 1804 was not Haiti's failure. It was the world's punishment. France sent warship. America sent embargoes. Then America sent marines. Then Citibank sent debt collectors. Then France and America sent a coup. And today, 2 centuries later, they look at the robots they built and point at Haiti and say, look at how poor they are. Look at how corrupt. Look at how broken. The question was never why Haiti is poor. The question is, how did they survive? How did a people who have been punished for 220 years for daring to be free still exist, still resist, still remember? That is the question worth asking. How did a people who have been punished for 220 years for daring to be free still exist, still resist, still remember? That is the question worth asking. And the answer, as always, is in the history they try to bury. That's what this platform is for.